I've been selected to chair tonight's session as a working journalist is that the organisers felt at this time of the night was appropriate for some grand simplifications. And who better to preside over that than a working journalist? I'll very briefly introduce the panel again. We have one new speaker who did not speak today, and that's John Willenge, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Alvestroke Group, a New York firm which specialises in investing and having hands-on operating participation in innovative entrepreneurial businesses. John received his mining engineering degree from the Curtin University of Technology and then a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Western Australia. He's the author of a best-selling Harvard Business School paper on venture capital and private equity, and he's a member of the board of the University of Western Australia Business School. On my immediate right is Philippa Malgren, who is a formidable woman in many ways, as those who were at today's proceedings will testify, but also a woman of great versatility. She is president and founder of her own asset management group based in London, which is involved in original research regarding risks to the market that are not easily quantified. Her clients include many investment banks, fund managers, hedge funds, as well as sovereign wealth funds. She's advised two American presidents, President Reagan and President George W. Bush. She's deeply versed in government, finance and industry. And I also note that she has a certificate from the 101st Airborne Division's Air Assault School. Some of you might care to ask her later on exactly what was involved in securing that certificate. And on my far right is our Renaissance man on the panel tonight, the Asian Century White Paper Task Force member, John Denton, cause partner and CEO. John is a lawyer, he is a business leader, he's an international advisor, he specialises in advising domestically on a range of issues, but also it's fair to say, I think, that he is in many ways an international networker and one of the most influential people in Australia. So in terms of this discussion, let me begin with John. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the west and move east tonight. John, you've just observed the recent United States presidential election. President Obama's been re-elected. What does this mean for the United States and for American policy over the course of the next 4 years?
I think to answer that question, you need to look at how could Obama's second term be different from his first term. And I think that many people found his first term disappointing. There was 2 years when he controlled the Senate and the House, and the major achievement was Obamacare. And I think people saw that as an opportunity with that level of political control to make some major fiscal changes. But I think you need to look at what's changed politically since he was elected and what's changed economically. His victory in the recent election was really, in many ways, remarkable if you think about the economic context. Unemployment had been over 8% for 43 of his 46 months as president. Growth is very low and tenuous. There's been a very significant fall in median household income, probably making it hard to digest food with all of this. But, and I think the most notable thing was there's been a staggering fall in median household net worth. Between 2007 and 2010, median household net worth had fallen by 40%. And so to see Obama win fairly conclusively in that situation, I thought was really quite remarkable.
Well, does this suggest at all that the United States is changing? Because essentially, to a certain extent, Obama attacked wealth creators. He adopted a brand of politics which a lot of Australians would have thought was not in the nature of American political identity. Is that a correct judgment, or does it mean that American political culture is changing?
I think there's two things. The culture is changing in that it unfortunately is bitterly partisan at the moment. But deeper than that, and perhaps more profound, there's very significant demographic change occurring in America. The Republican Party has traditionally been the party of the white male, and winning the white male vote in America has carried many Republican elections. What Obama was able to do was, I think, put a lot of the economic hardships onto George W. Bush, and I think people gave him somewhat of a pass on that. He was able to define a narrative against Mitt Romney as a very wealthy job outsourcer that was not supportive of the middle class. And Obama appealed to the Hispanic vote, which is an enormously growing demographic in the US and will define elections in the future. And then there were some very important social issues that came into play, and abortion was a very big one, for example. And women voters in exit polls have clearly demonstrated that they were very worried about the Republicans, the ultra-conservative Republicans that control a lot of the Republican Party, the fact that there were potentially up to 3 Supreme Court vacancies coming up during the next election. And many things in the US are determined at the Supreme Court level. So Roe v. Wade, which is the abortion, Bush-Gore, the election, you've seen Obamacare went to the Supreme Court, and people were very worried that whoever the next president is would appoint 3 like-minded Supreme Court justices who have a lifelong term. And what would that mean for social situation in America?
Well, let me just move to Philippa, and let me just ask, looking at a second Obama term, what is your judgment about the capacity of the United States, the capacity of the President, the powers of the President to try and resolve some of the institutional, economic and debt problems America faces?
I think it's highly unlikely that President Obama is going to be able to effectively address those issues, which is not exclusively his fault. That's a function of both sides refusing to negotiate. I think that the markets were right to sell down the stock market in the aftermath of the election because they had been too optimistic that somehow an Obama win would equal resolution of the debt problem. And in fact, what we have is something kind of like a Thelma and Louise moment where both Republicans and Democrats are daring the other one to go over the edge. And in fact, just today, Senator Reid announced that he's going to try to remove the so-called filibuster capability. In other words, to deny the Republicans the ability to stop or to impede progress on any issue in politics, which is going to make things extremely difficult. So personally, I think what will end up happening is the stock market will eventually realize how bad it is, that the president does not have the capacity to resolve the issue, and that we are going to go right up to the edge, if not over the fiscal cliff. We will have to shut the US government down for several weeks, maybe more than once, and that actually this needs to be priced in. It's not priced in, and Congress won't respond until the stock market forces them to. So I don't see the president really being able to override all that.
Well, that's a pretty pessimistic analysis that you've just given us. What it suggests is that the polarisation and the divisions in the United States political system, if anything, will just get worse. So extrapolating from that, what does that mean? Does this mean that you're a pessimist about America's prospects as we look out to the medium term, or not? And if you're not, what is the offsetting argument?
Well, I have to say, no, I'm extremely optimistic and have been about the United States. But having grown up in politics, my father served 4 presidents and I've served 2 presidents. When Washington gets itself into an impasse, it's not necessarily such a bad thing, right? The rest of the country can progress without Washington getting in its way. That's one way to think about politics as well. But bottom line is, the U.S. is actually doing remarkably well. I mentioned in my talk earlier today about manufacturing returning from China. Just to put a little granularity on that, to give people a sense of how deep this is. Companies as diverse as General Electric, Otis Elevators, Caterpillar Farmland Equipment, Brooks Brothers, the suit manufacturer. I mean, even Whammo, that makes frisbees and hula hoops, have moved the production back to the United States. ATM machines are being built in the United States again. It is broad and it is deep, and it is not going to be affected by whether Washington can sort out the debt issue or not. The United States is competitive again in a way it has not been for many years. But we also have a boom going on in agriculture, in energy extraction, and in mining. So overall, I'm very upbeat about what will happen in the US, but the innovation that's occurring isn't so widely recognized yet. And we're going to get innovation in politics as well. What we're seeing at the local level for governments is defaults, restructuring of the debt. It's just people want a top-down announcement. They want the president to announce they're going to fix the debt problem, when in fact what you're seeing is a grassroots, bottom-up kind of phenomena. So there isn't any one announcement. At the local level, people are addressing the outstanding issues.
Well, let me just ask you a further follow-up question before I go to other panel members. We've just had in this country an Asian century white paper. That is, the premise is that the coming century is an Asian century, and the focus has been very much on China. If you were the principal advisor to the Australian Prime Minister and able to go and seek advice on the future, would you travel to China or would you travel to the United States, and why?
Well, call me biased, but I would be traveling to the United States.
Why is that?
But let me be clear. I've had this view now for several years that Australia has linked its future too exclusively to China. I'm not saying that China isn't part of Australia's future. I'm just saying it's not the only future for Australia, and that in fact having a diversified customer base is a smarter way to go, no matter what assets or services this economy is producing. And the fact is that we look at China today and what we see is a very troubled environment. I mean, one issue that didn't come up today I thought was interesting is, I don't know how much you guys have followed these events in Wuhan in China, where they've had the first spontaneous democratic elections in China since the communists came to power, which is a reflection of a grassroots response to the fact that the economy is not able to deliver a better future. And people are actually turfing out local officials and electing their own. So, will the Chinese address this over time? Yes, absolutely. But I can see in the next decade, I would bet a lot more money that the US will figure out how to make profits and generate GDP faster than China will be able to sort out how to shift from an export-led economy to a domestic demand-led economy. That is a more than 10-year process. So I'm not writing off China. I'm just saying a balanced approach makes a lot more sense to me.
Okay, well that's a very firm statement there of confidence in the United States. Let me now go to John Denton. John had a substantial input into the white paper. He's well acquainted with the arguments in the white paper. So my question to you, John, having heard what Philippa's got to say is, did the white paper get it wrong?
Well, can I just flip back before I answer that question? I just want to make a comment if I could about the US. Allow me the liberty.
Of course.
Because it's after dinner.
Well, that's not really. No, I'm only too keen for you to talk on America.
I think that it's actually interesting to look at US politics, and I look at it from a slightly different prism, which is, what does it say about functioning liberal democracies. And one thing that you can discern, and in a way we can look at a little bit here, but we can look at also in Europe as well, we all have a proud tradition of liberal democracies. What you discern though is that there's a lot more goodwill that's actually required to make our systems work. And that when that goodwill gets sucked out, we've got some pretty creaky systems to keep pushing along, and they don't function that well. And I think you can see that as a case in point in the US, where the absence of the kind of goodwill that allowed the Congress to operate has actually been sucked dry, and it's become quite complex, and it's actually quite interesting. It's also quite interesting to look at that more broadly as to what it says about liberal democracies around the globe. And now, of course, you're confronted with situations where real choices need to be made, and those choices will require some substantive trade-offs, and parts of the system will now be sorely tested. And you start to see some of the challenges, particularly in Europe, where there was this sense that democracy was enduring, but when you start seeing the goodwill sucked away as the choices are made, it gets sorely tested. Just an observation more than a debating point.
It's an observation which raises all sorts of issues.
It wasn't trying to avoid the question.
No, I know you weren't. I wouldn't suggest for one moment you were trying to avoid the question. I understand that. But let's just to follow up on what you've just said. Do you think that these recent tribulations in American democracy that you're talking about, is this the new status quo? Is this just a period of transition? If you look at American history, America has had very substantial periods of deep tribulation, whether we're talking now about the Civil War, or if we're talking about the Great Depression, divisions in the 1930s, divisions in the 1920s even in the United States. So what's your judgment? Is it the new status quo, or is it just one of these phases that America goes through in its history?
I see it as a phase. I will now answer your question because I actually think that the story of America's demise is misunderstood and is just plain wrong. I think, and I was alluding to this in my comments earlier today, that if you think about sources of power in the 21st century, the key source of power is this thing called connectedness and interconnectedness. And I think that if there's an economy in the world that has that in spades, it's the US. It's the mere openness of it all. The fact that generation after generation of migrants come, businesses succeed, fails, sectors rise and fall, etc., and it keeps pushing on, says to me here is a power that will endure.
Okay, well this just raises further the question I asked, which you haven't really answered. I
haven't finished.
well, good, because the question was, because I asked Philippa, should the advisor to the Prime Minister go to China or the United States to see the future? And she said the United States. So I therefore ask, have we somehow got the white paper wrong?
But I think that to allow a conclusion like that to settle is to misunderstand, one, the purpose of the white paper, two, its design, and three, the way in which it's balanced. And if I can say, the purpose of the white paper was never set out as a foreign policy document. Let's be very clear about that. It was really, how do you create an environment and a series of frameworks which can allow a discussion on continuing domestic reform to take place and make sense of it to people who are actually seeing things happen to them without being involved in the process of understanding why this is going on. And that's really the Australian public. I mean, what is the importance of Asia to us? Why is it relevant to them? Don't they deserve a discussion about their future? And in many respects, if you look at the way the white paper is framed, it sets up irrefutably the importance of the Asian century and then tries to find a way to reach out and explain, well, how can we as a nation rise up to the challenges, be aware of the opportunities, also be aware of the pitfalls. But it will require more change, not less, and it will not necessarily be straightforward. It also creates a framework for us to have some of these debates about trade-offs. And that's when you get to the issue that you hear talked about. Should we trade off our values to further integrate into Asia? Should we trade off our democracy to further integrate into Asia? Should we trade off our relationship with the US to further integrate into Asia. I, by the way, don't believe the answer to the question is yes, yes and yes. I actually think we need to have the discussion though, because it's actually a much more vital part of the broader political discussion in Australia than I might have thought. There are senior people in this country who do think that we should trade off part of our relationship with the US as we look towards China. In many respects, I think if China had its dream outcome, that might be one of the things on it, but they don't expect to get that.
Okay, well, hold that thought, because what I want to do is I want to come back to you and identify more about what you think we've got to keep and what you think we've got to lose. So I'll come back to you, but I just want to move back to John, because two important issues have been raised about the United States, and I'd like to get your response to that. First of all, on the question of whether you're an optimist or pessimist about America, what are your thoughts? Which side do you come down on, and why?
I am optimistic about America because the intellectual horsepower and the ability to solve problems, mobilise capital and so on is so great. With that said, it's difficult to plot an exact path of how the US gets out of the current situation, as much as anything because there is such a toxic environment. But if you look at the situation right now and how firmly each party has drawn lines in the sand and how their ideology is so different from one another, you notice a couple of things. One is that the Republican Party is controlled by ultra-conservatives at the moment, and the Democratic Party is controlled by very strong liberals. And they've decided that even in the face of a $1.3 trillion deficit, that they won't come together and figure out a way to solve the problem. And they nearly need an external crisis to lift them to rise up above the partisanship, and also I think to give each of them a safe phasing thing where they can actually step back from these very difficult lines in the sand that they have drawn.
How frustrated is the corporate sector in the United States, is the business community towards the political system? I mean, the description Philip has given is that the political system is really dysfunctional, and that's consistent with what you've said. So how is the community, and in particular the business and financial community, responding to that?
Well, the financial community, I would say, and the business community is completely exasperated. It seemed, it's hard to believe that the debt committee in August 2011 couldn't come up with a solution, that we lost the AAA credit rating and so on and so on. If people just didn't think it could possibly come to that. What it means from a practical perspective is it's very difficult with the fiscal cliff coming, changes in tax rates, with Obamacare coming in and so on, to make investment decisions because so many variables are unknown. And as everybody knows, the most crippling thing for business is uncertainty. You simply don't have the framework to make good decisions. How does America get through this? I think that there needs to be, I do believe that the political parties are both now controlled by quite extreme elements. And so the Republicans coming out and saying, yes, we want to reduce this deficit, but we don't want to raise taxes. And the Democrats coming out and saying, yes, we'll reduce entitlements, but only if there's tax increases on the rich. They're very difficult positions to find middle ground with. And so I don't know what the crisis is. I think the fiscal cliff, which is really an artificial man-made crisis, was designed to put enough heat on people that they would rise above the partisanship and do something. I don't know if I'm as negative as Philippa, but they're certainly not going to come to a grand bargain before the end of the year. Tax rates are going to go up very significantly. Defence spending and other things are going to go down. And we're going to be in this difficult situation where we're all going to look and say, how painful does this actually need to get before people bridge the partisanship gap?
Philippa, one of the assumptions on which the Asian century debate is premised in this country is that at the end of the day, China and America can avoid a catastrophe. That is, the paper is looking at opportunities. And one of the criticisms of the paper is that it's too bullish. It's focused too much on opportunities and doesn't focus enough on the challenges or the downside. So from your perspective, how do you see the future of the relationship between the United States and China? What are the warning signs here? What are the benchmarks?
Well, I think that the US-China relationship has become increasingly confrontational over the course of the last decade. I think, look, when the world economy is doing well and everybody can have a better future, this diminishes conflict and it raises tolerance. And we now reverse this picture because now people don't believe they're going to get rich before they get old. That is true not only in China, but the United States as well. And suddenly conflict comes back onto the landscape. This is exacerbated by some of the policy choices being made. So as I said earlier today, the Chinese view is that America has a long history of paying for debt problems through inflation. And that we fully intend to deal with the current debt problem through an inflationary path, which hurts China not only in that they hold US treasuries, that's the least of their worries. Their great concern is the export of inflation to them. And they will be the first to say that Tiananmen Square happened against the backdrop of 14% inflation. Inflation is not socially easy to manage in any emerging market, but particularly in one that large. So again, their focus now is on how to secure control of supply lines of the critical assets required to keep that economy stable, particularly in light of the fact that they're losing the manufacturing base to the West, particularly the US. And this is why we cannot be surprised when we see more incidents in the South China Sea around energy assets that the Chinese perceive to have immense value. It's also about shipping lanes and their desire to secure greater control over those, because the fact is that the US Navy does stand there as a potential threat. It has the ability to interdict that traffic if the US wanted to. We always say, of course, we would never do that. And the Chinese say, then what are you doing here? And we kind of go, I don't know, we're just here, right? You know, we don't give them a good answer either as to why we have deployed such resources in the region. You know, the Chinese refer to ASEAN as a China containment policy by Washington. Right? And that is one way you could look at it. So generally speaking, I think we have to expect that we are going to have more conflict, more confrontation in a world where we don't have faith so much in the future and where inflation does drive China to be more aggressive about controlling supply lines of assets. And this will happen not only in Southeast Asia, but more globally as well. And we see the Chinese being very active in physical parts of the world way beyond the South China Sea. Just a few days ago, there was an interesting news story about the Chinese trying to take control of a former US military facility in the Azores. You know, this is different parts of the world where they're saying, you know, we need to have a physical base for security in China. That's a very different world than we had 15 years ago.
I mean, whenever we've seen in history a rising new world power, tension is inevitable. There's no question about that. So it's really how effectively the tension is managed. What are the networks for consultation and contact and crisis management between the two sides that will ensure that the rivalry you've talked about, which will intensify, can be contained. So what I'd like to ask you is, how do you rate the possibility of something going wrong and there being a form of armed conflict?
Well, I think, look, when we think about commodities as a potential source of conflict, it doesn't necessarily imply armed military conflict. It can also be the conflict it creates within a state among the citizens. So I think one of the most interesting and troubling events we see on the landscape today is the way in which many Japanese manufacturing facilities have had to shut down their operations in China because of the disputes over the South China Sea, and now Chinese citizens attacking Japanese facilities. So Sharp, Panasonic, major Japanese companies have had to either completely close or close for periods of time their production facilities. Now, how hard is it to imagine that the US and China get into some kind of a dispute and we see that same level of hostility directed towards American production facilities in China? You already have entities like Foxconn where the employees are committing civil unrest acts ranging from suicides to actually physically sabotaging the production line. And that's where we find Apple computers, Dell computers being produced. So could we have an incident that isn't military in nature, but nonetheless represents conflict? Absolutely. And let's face it, we are not going to be able to say to the Chinese, I'm terribly sorry, but you're no longer as competitive as you were. You have to learn how to live on less. Those billion people are not going to go quietly. We have to help this country figure out how they're going to make a living for these billion citizens. And our failure to do that should surprise us if we get conflict issues. Now, might we have actual military conflict? Well, it's only a month and a half ago, the Secretary of Defense in the United States said that this is a real possibility, given that our naval vessels and their naval vessels are within half a nautical mile of each other in the South China Sea. So yeah, there's a possibility, but hopefully the channels are good. I notice that every time the Chinese say, we are no longer going to hold military exercises with the United States because we're mad about this or that issue, Australia steps in and says, we'll hold joint military exercises with both sides. And I do think that's going to be part of Australia's role, is to manage, be an interlocutor between both sides and to calm the waters when it's required.
John, what's your response to some of those points?
Well, actually, I think that in terms of managing superpower and emerging power relations, there is probably no country on earth that has better experience than the US. I mean, this is an economy, a state that managed its way through the difficult days of the Cold War successfully. I think that there's also a mistake sometimes made in Australian circles to underestimate the level of engagement that takes place between the US and the Chinese administrations at all levels on a continuous basis. Because the Americans know how to do this stuff. They're actually very good at it. Accidents do happen. We know that. Accidents can happen. From time to time you can see that. South China Sea is particularly interesting because actually if you look at all the countries involved, the country with the least experience in dealing with China, the country with the least trade exposure to dealing with China is the country most likely to actually cause an accident, and that's actually the Philippines.
Well, can I just ask, if we see the vision in the white paper unfold, if we see the glorious vision unfold, what are the strategic consequences of this? In particular, John, what sort of leverage does China have over Australia, given that our living standards, off the back of taking the opportunities in the Asian century, mean that our prosperity is tied very much to China? What sort of leverage does that give China over us?
Well, I think if we're unthinking in our policy making and if we're unthinking in our execution of foreign policy and we surrendered ourselves completely into a bilateral relationship and shunned all others, then there's maximum leverage available. But that is actually not the thinking, and that is not the national interest that serves, that needs to be protected or advanced. One thing that is interesting, I think, when we look at the white paper, is it's a paper which is not about China. Of course, it's a paper which includes a very large focus on China, but also includes a very important focus on India, a very important focus on Indonesia, without taking away any of the focus required for Japan and Korea. It's the genius of the and, Paul, if I can put it that way. But the reason we talk about upgrading the focus on China, India and Indonesia in particular is because the potential enormity of the engagement between the economies is such that it requires prioritization. if you want to execute and get things done.
Okay, I want to go back to the point that you'd reached before, because the issue you'd raised was the issue of trade-offs. What sort of trade-off decisions does Australia have to take if it's to successfully integrate with Asia and socialise ourselves into Asia, which is the white paper vision? And I'm talking here not just in strategic terms, I'm talking in cultural terms. What do we have to leave behind from the Australian past? What is there from the past that needs to be shunted aside and forgotten as we moved on? Now, of course, the great example of this was our racially discriminatory immigration policy, of course, which has been abandoned. But when you look at what else we need to abandon in terms of this cultural adjustment, what is it? Because I think this is a very important issue as far as far as the Australian people are concerned. And what are the new things we have to incorporate into our culture in order to succeed?
I think it's a, if I may say so, a brilliant question, Paul. Perhaps I can answer it this way. When you talk about cultural change, I look at not so much as what you leave behind, but what you emphasise. It's actually a positive engagement, not a negative engagement. It's not a matter of looking at who we are and saying there's so much of us which is bad. It's looking at saying, well, for what we need to confront of the future, what aspects of our culture do we need to emphasise? I think people in business would often pronounce that one thing's for sure, culture eats strategy. So understanding that and emphasising the aspects of the culture which will be as positive and conducive to success of the Asian century is something we must do. And of course that for me is about the openness of the economy. The openness of the economy and the willingness to engage and to connect. It's actually a very important issue for me. The argument which is often thought to have been won and settled and from which we move on is a constant support for the open economy in Australia. I actually don't believe that argument is won and settled. I think that is an argument that needs to be constantly run. I do think in 25, 40 years, we will look back and see a mix of the culture where the cultural default, if I put it this way, is no longer the Anglosphere, but will actually be a kind of more of a hybrid. It's not Australia is an Asian nation. It is that Australia has changed and there's aspects of the culture which are much more emphasised now. And actually you will see a lot more interplay, I think, between the various economies in the region. But Australia needs to be open to that. We also need to be open to the danger of anachronistic thinking about the region. We need to also be very contemporaneous. We need to allow ourselves to learn from the ideas and innovations that are generated from within the region itself and respect those. It's actually being contemporaneous in our thinking and actually opening ourselves up further.
Okay, we're getting very close to the end game of this panel, so just wrapping up with each panellist. John, looking at Australia from your perspective now in the United States, how do you see Australia? How do you see our strengths? How do you see our weaknesses from your particular perspective? And what are the sorts of changes that you think Australia most needs to make in order to succeed?
I'm extremely positive about Australia. I've been spending most of my time over the last 15 years in the US, but every time I come back, I like what I see, and so much that I like is Australia in very many positive, important ways. Entrepreneurship, praising success and high achievement, brilliant education system and so on. I think one observation that I have out of all of this is Australia can't look like the regional office for the US. We have to have our own, which we do, intellectual viewpoints. We have to be strongly independent. Of course, America will always be a very dear ally and so on. But I think that if you look like you're mini America or beholden to America, I think that is an issue and that Australia needs to be a close ally but be very independent in its thinking and perspective.
Okay, but the fact that you've raised that presumably means you think this, I mean, do you think there is a perception that we are the regional office of the United States?
I don't think there is, but I do see it as a risk. I think particularly, I mean, the dialogue going on between the American political leadership and Australian political leadership is just fantastic. But I think that needs to be managed very carefully.
Philip, a final question as far as you're concerned. You've got enormous international experience looking at a range of different countries. When you look at Australia, our unique circumstances, the opportunities and challenges we've got, what do you see as the critical couple of policy directions that we need to focus on, the critical couple of things we most need to get right?
I think maybe answering your previous question, but it gets to this question as well. Australia needs to give up being not competitive. And I put that way very deliberately. The global economy is remarkably fluid and changing and entrepreneurial in its response. And the fact is, we're seeing immense innovation in the world economy. Immense innovation I described in the United States. China is going to redefine its business model now that they've lost the business model they had. And the question is, what is Australia doing to reinvent itself, to become competitive? I think there's still a tendency in this country to lean on raw materials and resources too heavily. The cost base for that is rising so rapidly as to render many of the deals and the projects here simply not competitive on a global landscape. And that's why we're going to hear about more closures of projects across Australia. This is fixable, but it does require understanding how do we stack up compared to the rest of the world who are innovating as fast as they can to save their lives. In this sense, Australia's had a very protected situation for a while, and I don't think you've ever felt the impact of the global financial crisis the way most places felt it. And so what does it take for Australia to register that it needs to reinvent and become competitive again? Hopefully it's not a level of pain created by a downturn. Hopefully we don't have to wait for such an event. We can start to innovate before that happens. But that's why I point out that Australia is one of the few Western industrialized countries that's not benefiting from the movement of manufacturing out of China. Why is that? What is it that Australia is not doing to cultivate that? So I think these are the issues that concern me. It's not that I don't think Australia can't innovate. I think it can. But I think your impetus to innovation is not so strong currently.
And final question to John Denton, and we'll close the panel at that point. John, looking at the white paper, the opportunities are simply enormous. The white paper documents those opportunities. But when you look at Australian history, there is a characteristic at work. Often Australia is not all that good at seizing opportunities. It tends to wait until things get bad, until storm clouds arrive, until there's some sort of crisis, and then everyone decides, hey, the situation is serious, we've got to get our act together and do something about it. And of course, that's not where we are now, because we are enjoying this mining and resources boom, and this will continue to go on for quite some time. So we're not going to have another sort of crisis to generate that sense of urgency. What we've got to do is we've just got to go out and seize the opportunity. So given our national character that I've just described, which you may or may not agree with, how do you see our ability and capacity to go out and make the opportunities in the white paper happen?
Well, Paul, never let necessity be the mother of your innovation, if I can start from that point. I think that the the challenge is we could have written an ambition which was within the scope of achievement in the next 5 years. We could have written down. But then it wouldn't be ambitious, would it? It actually defies definition. So the important thing, in a sense, is to generate a vision around which people can organise. The challenge, of course, is that the vision and the ambitions as laid out require more than a tick-off by a bureaucratic committee somewhere. It actually calls for a whole of Australia action. It actually calls for, well, put it this way, if we're at a university, one of the ambitions is 10 universities in the top 100. Now people say, well, where's the money? Money was only ever going to be part of this. It actually requires a fundamental rethinking of the way in which education policy is contemplated and developed in this country. That is something that's within the ability of the polity to actually come to right now, to work that process through. It's a matter of changing mindsets. One of the counterpoints that's put up is, how can you talk about getting closer and engaging in the way you are with Asia when the government, for its own reasons, they're not my decisions, cut spending for boots on the ground in terms of embassies, etc. Well, maybe what it also says when you look at the white paper is that we need to think through different ways of executing our foreign policy priorities. We actually spend a lot of time on the white paper rehearsing a concept which is called second track diplomacy. What we're saying is we are actually going to have to think in different ways about the future and the way in which we can execute it. We actually have the tools available to us. A lot of it comes down to the will. The danger was always that the ambition that would actually emerge would be so manageable that it was like, why weren't we doing this anyway? We actually had to create a different way of thinking about the future in order to try and push the opportunity for further reform in the nation. That's what we hope we've achieved.
I think tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a really interesting group of perspectives. I wonder if you could show your appreciation to the two Johns and Philippa.